Perfect.
So my name is Dan Beck. I'm the director of LGRMS, and as I said a while back, I didn't develop this presentation that I'm going to go through. It's only going to take about 5 minutes. James Westbury, who is a former claims manager, but litigation attorney and specialist defense counsel, developed this. So forgive me if I misstate anything. I'm just going to kind of read through some of the slides. And then Emily Davenport, who has some expertise in regards to stormwater management from the city of Valdosta, is going to go through her slide. As I said, initially, we'll be sending out a link to the recording along with the PowerPoint presentations to all those that registered. We want as much as interactivity and or comments as you have. If you have expertise, please send us questions, send me documents. Would love to be able to forward that information to all those participating. We did have about 90 people registered for this event. With that said, I'm going to go through some of these slides. So again, there's liability for increasing. This is not the slides I was looking for, but I'm going to go through. I'm going to go find the slide I wanted to start with first. Again, from a why are we here? You know, sewer backed up into a manhole backyard. It was a 1 million plus claim. This is with one of our cities. We had a storm water runoff to failure to maintain drainage systems. It was a $500,000 verdict. We had failure to maintain pipes under property, which is a big claim. We've had permitting and development inadequately engineered and accepting dedication of draining systems, and failure to maintain infrastructure, all claims that we have suffered in the millions of dollars, more so on the city side, but we also have had these on the county side. So with that said, I'm going to kind of go through some previous slides. It didn't pull up the presentation I was looking for. Let's see if I can get through this. Again, here's just again liability for increasing surface water runoff, where two lots adjoin, the lower lot owes servitude to the higher, so far as to receive the water which naturally runs from it, provided the owner of the latter has done no act to increase the flow by artificial means. Said differently, where the higher lot owner increases the burden to the lower lot artificially, there is a liability. And again, that's just from a definition of liability perspective. While municipalities have sovereign immunity for performance of governmental functions, it may be liable for damage it caused to third party for creation of maintenance of nuisance. And we'll kind of go through some of these different things. The sole act of approving a construction project cannot impose liability for nuisance. City actions must constitute exercise of control or acceptance so as to establish a duty on part of the cities to adequately maintain it. Undertaking maintenance, it is not necessary for a city to have constructed a drainage system if it undertook to maintain it. So again, if they don't necessarily have the project, but they have said they will maintain it, then that's the liability. The city may create liability for nuisance where it undertakes to maintain the system and accept responsibility for maintaining it. And I'm not going to go through that, not going to go through that. So from a county perspective, damages against a county, counties are generally not liable for nuisance. Counties can be held liable for nuisance only under the constitutional and eminent domain provision against taking or damaging private property for public purposes without adequate and just compensation. Counties may be liable for damages if it creates a condition such as nuisance that amounts to inverse condemnation. Plaintiffs may recover only if it if it amounts to taking property without just compensation. Measures of damages, and I'm not going to go through the rest of that. Damages against the city, again, we kind of really covered those specifically, but special damages for recovery of rental or market value of property are available. Damages are also available. Unlawful interference with the rights of the owner to enjoy possession of the property may be an element of the damages. The measure of damages for discomfort, loss of peace of mind, unhappiness, and annoyance of the plaintiff caused by the maintenance of a nuisance is for the enlightened consciousness of the jury. And we went through that, and that's about it. So I don't really have, again, the expertise to go through that. But if you have any legal questions regarding claims, regarding acceptable claims or not, then I would send those to me. I can send those to our adjusters on the city side and our adjusters on the county side, and they will be able to provide more specific information. So I apologize for my poor attempt to provide that information. With that said, you are very, very blessed to have Emily Davenport present the next information. She is, again, did this for the city of Valdosta. With that said, Emily, take it away.
Thank you, Dan. Are you able to see my screen, my PowerPoint?
I am able to see it perfectly.
All right. Perfect. Well, thank you all for joining today's session on stormwater management. As Dan was just speaking, I think we all know if we've been in local government, much less utilities and infrastructure, that there's always something that can happen. And lots of times what we do find out is we don't have enough resources or people. And this is where claims and issues can happen, which can become extremely expensive. It can also get into issues if you're doing work outside of city property or county property. So lots of factors to consider. And so what we really want to do today, because we've actually got a pretty good mix of about half of those are registered are part of a phase 1 or phase 2 community. So that means they are permitted by the state of Georgia. And the other half are actually cities that are not permitted. So not knowing exactly where that level of them are, we're going to kind of talk from a basic perspective and then work our way up. But please, if you think of any questions or anything that we're talking about, please drop those in the chat so we can make sure that we address it. So with that, I wanted to go ahead and let's start here. Resume. All right. So as Dan was kind of talking about some of the legal perspective of it, I really wanted to start from just understanding, if you're like me, I'm a visual person, of what is stormwater. So this is really when it rains or snows and that water comes across the property. This is a great graphic that I found early in my career that really showed if you've got more vegetation, then you have less runoff. And as you can see in the images, if you work your way from left to right, the more that has been developed over time, we increase in that stormwater. This is where we've got a lot of water just running off. It's not been able to absorb into the ground. This is why we see a lot of our streams and waterways now that are just, you know, dry as a bone, and then a rain event comes and they just completely fill up. And then drop again really quickly, which can cause additional issues with stream bank failure and stuff like that. But wanted to give you a visual of kind of what we're talking about, and also just to remind everybody that regardless of the size of your community, we are all being impacted by stormwater, and we are paying for it in some way or another. So we're not going to really talk about the money side of it, but of course, I'm happy to help answer any of those kind of questions. So I should have really kind of explained a little bit of my background. When I came to the city of Valdosta in 2007, I was their stormwater superintendent for operations and maintenance of the stormwater program. I worked my way up into stormwater manager and the assistant director of engineering. But really, I handled everything from the stormwater utility, all the operation and maintenance, to capital, did the master planning, did utility billing. So I had a little piece of all those to make sure that we had a functional stormwater program. But with that, when you kind of look at stormwater, I wanted to show obviously this image of Georgia where you can see every single community has some kind of impact within hydrology. So we've got major streams, we've got canals, we've got tributaries, but water is coming all across the state. Now, as far as it works in terms of permitting, so we have 537 cities and 159 counties, and I've listed out here on this slide so you can see how many of the cities and counties are permitted through the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, if that's not a mouthful for you, the MS4. But this is where these cities and counties are regulated by the state of Georgia to address stormwater. They are permitted. They have certain requirements they have to do every year. And then, of course, they renew their permit every 5. So as you can see, of the cities that do fall in and the counties that fall into the phase 1, 2 for medium large or to the phase 2, we're really only looking at about, 22% of the cities that are permitted, and then 28 of the counties are permitted. So we have a lot of communities that are not being permitted, but still facing the same challenges that we are. So when you think about common issues, I think we can all relate to the pictures that you see. We all have street flooding, we all have property flooding. We end up with that sedimentation that comes out from construction sites, especially being in Georgia with that Georgia red clay. We've all seen those overflowing manholes, which Dan mentioned as one of the potential lawsuits that had happened before. Also, you see those holes. Lots of times people call them sinkholes, but they're really not sinkholes. But you see these holes that come up either in concrete or asphalt, and you also see it in vegetated areas. Tree loss, hazards. So this picture that you're seeing that shows a hazard is actually a road that goes into a concrete ditch, and then you see the car bumps, which then goes into a parking lot. So when it's a regular day, you can see it. It's normal, like if you pass by it, but when you get water in it, if you're not familiar with that area, you probably don't know that that drops off significantly into an asphalt ditch. And then, of course, erosion. So we all are experiencing this, where that's a line that's now been exposed because of erosion through stormwater. So every single one of these things you can find in any community, regardless of your size. But, we have to kind of look at it and see like what is causing some of these issues so we can address them and they don't become more of the norm and just what we have to accept. So we have to ask ourselves why. And when you look at the whys of what's happening in the stormwater, so much of it does come back to undersized systems. They were built decades ago. We've seen increases in development prior to regulations. You've got properties that were built prior to flood maps. So we have properties now that are flooding that are in the 100-year flood zone, but back when they built in the 40s or 50s, there was no flood map. We often see with that erosion and sedimentation, when you see this coming into the streets and waterways, a lot of it ties back into the inadequate erosion and sedimentation best management practices. So while larger developments do require plan review and all that kind of stuff, sometimes people aren't keeping those BMPs up to date. Sometimes what's happening is something falls down or they didn't do something or somebody's not staying on it. And then, of course, when we don't control that and basically facilitate over those who are doing it, making sure they're keeping them up, then we can cause these other issues. That manhole that's overflowing, typically that's what we know as I&I, which is inflow and infiltration. So this is where water that is any other source other than wastewater is getting into the sewer system and it's just oversaturating it. We don't like to see those things, but especially in major rain events, you will see this happen. And this is why it's so important that we're doing inspections and tracking to make sure that we're not increasing the amount of inflow and infiltration that's happening. Those sinkholes that we talked about and saw that picture of a little bit ago, lots of times that's what they just refer back to leaking joints or a leaking box. And so that's where your pipes come together and they separate. So that's a leaking joint. And if that water's coming through or water's coming through the ground, it will start to suck in those areas. And then you do start to have those voids, which pops up those holes. Same thing with the pipe that's coming into the box. If that seal is not solid, then you will start having water coming through, because you think about it, those things get overfilled really quickly too. And so it's just pulling out what it can. And if it's a weak point, that's where it's going to go. We've definitely seen an increase in the flow of our waterways. This is definitely a quantity issue and a velocity issue. This is where we're seeing stuff going from point A to point B so much faster now. Which is causing that stream bank erosion, which is causing that tree loss. And, it's definitely something that we're seeing more about. And of course, anybody who's doing new development, yes, there are stormwater regulations that you have to do it if it's over 5,000 square feet of new impervious area. But there's a lot that's been done over the years that now we're having to retrofit our systems. And of course, there's always inadequate resources. Nobody has enough funding or staff or equipment. And if you do, I would love to come to your city and know what it's like, because I think we all know we're really working on shoestring budgets and trying to get as much done as possible, in addition to all the other things. And especially for a lot of our smaller communities, the same person who does water and sewer is doing your stormwater. And whatever takes a higher priority is where you're going to focus your efforts in, and not be evenly distributed, which is understood when you have to basically prioritize. And then last but not least, and I think this is where so much of the focus needs to come back, especially from looking at liability standpoints, is the lack of inspections and the maintenance that's happening. I will tell you, before we were permitted in the city of Valdosta, we were not doing inspections and maintenance to the level that we are now. So in a way, while it was frustrating to have to do this permit, in a way, it really elevated what we were doing and held us a lot more accountable. And we actually were able to increase so many of our services and reduce a lot of flood risk. So when you think about all these things that are kind of coming against us, the things that we're dealing with, I think we always say, what can we do next? And how do we address it? And so this is where I bring up R&D. And so this is not research and development. What this is actually rip off and duplicate. So talk to your other communities, see what they're doing. We have got some excellent examples that are on this call today of those who are doing wonderful jobs with stormwater. And so instead of recreating that wheel, look at what other people are doing. If they've got forms or manuals or techniques, talk with them, and I guarantee you they would be willing to share that information with you so you're not starting from scratch. So with that in mind, I really wanted to start with where do we go? And so we're going to start with mapping your stormwater system. And so why is this important? So the main thing that really comes to my mind when I think about it is if you don't know your system and where it's at, then how are you going to maintain it to the level it needs to be done? But at the same time, if you're working from stuff that's in people's minds, that is literally on some old document somewhere tucked away in another building, there's going to be chances you're going to miss stuff, and it's definitely not going to be the most efficient way. But this is where we need to be passing that torch. We need to be getting that information documented, so when somebody does leave to go move to Tahiti, when they win the lottery, we don't have to keep trying to call them to figure out where something is. This is where we need to get that information now from them, map it, so that we can pass that torch to the next generation and definitely improve what we're doing. So we're going to go from kind of a basic to an advanced way of doing this. And so this is really kind of, you know, from a basic standpoint, you can do everything from just simply having a map printed. Typically your RC will do that for you at no cost or either very minimal. And you can literally draw it in. And if you can do that, then that gives you a place of start of mapping your system. Because I understand that there are some people, this is all they have. When you move more to that advanced side, this is where you're talking about everything being digital. You've got everything GPS, which is global positioning systems. You've got the data that you need. You're able to click on those features and see what is it, when was it constructed, what materials, length, everything. GIS and using that GPS side of things is just such a wonderful tool. And I was very blessed early in my career to use it and thankfully be able to help transition that into what we did at Valdosta. So with that, I'm going to kind of jump into Valdostas and what we did. So initially when I started, we literally had yellow notepads and a coffee can full of sharpened pencils. That is how our guys were tracking what they were doing with stormwater. And when you think about it, we'd had a stormwater program for years. It actually started in public works. It moved to utilities in '97, and then we actually moved over to engineering. But when I first got there, literally that's what we had, was the notepads. And now I had a computer, so it was really different. But when I got to my staff, they didn't have computers. It was just desk and the notepads and pencils. We worked our way to a basic, which is literally a map book, and then we worked our way fully into the advanced system where everybody's using GIS from a digital perspective now. And so we're going to kind of walk you through each of those. So going from this to that, from that paper to the paper map, I cannot say enough to the South Georgia Regional Commission. We actually worked with them. They allowed us to use one of their GPS units, so we were able to go out and GPS all of our infrastructure because we knew it best versus them having a staff person who didn't really know it as well. So we GPSed everything. They actually did all the post-processing for us, which is where they make the corrections. So even though you're using a GPS, sometimes depending on the satellites and the cloud coverage, you may end up having, you know, a storm pipe here and then a catch basin right here, but the two should be connected. They can help create some of that, correct that data for you. And then of course they had servers. So they maintained all of our data, which also was really, really great for us because them having our data also allowed us access to the rest of the county as well as the region. So we were able to kind of incorporate a lot of different data shapefiles. I have put on the link there, so if you guys want to check out the Valor GIS, it's Valdosta Lounge, so both pay a significant amount of money to have GIS services. So even though a lot of the stuff is done by city or county staff, we have got a fantastic relationship with them in terms of that data and how we use it, and then being able to work with them for anything that we have GIS. So it could be anything from water, sewer, historic preservation, parks, roads, curbs, you name it. We have so many different things mapped out, and that's all tied back into that system, and it's a great place to check out. So once we got everything mapped out, we realized, okay, we need to utilize this data. And so there was one stormwater employee that had a computer and GIS software, which was me. And at that time, I actually had ArcMap, so I was able to do my own data corrections and creations. But then we had 0 employees in the operation maintenance department that had access to it. So again, they had notepads and no computers, so they weren't even able to access it. So what we did is we took that GIS information and we actually created map books. So we had a large map that was done, we put a grid system in it, and then we basically did 11 by 17 pages that included the data in a paper format for them. And the main thing I want to point out in that is I didn't just create it, and neither did our GIS people. What happened is we worked directly with our staff. So it was important from the very beginning for me to make sure that we were working with our staff to have something that was usable, that was something they could understand, because y'all know we can muddy up a lot of data with all of it in terms of a map, but we want it to be really simplified for them so they can get in there, do their job, and keep moving. From that, we also ended up doing some additional mapping afterwards. So as we got those map books created, we also inherited the street sweeping program. And so I got a new sweeper and I got an operator, but there was no route system. And so we really were sweeping in the dark. And so after a couple of months, I had my street sweeper guy come in. We had that large map out. I gave him a highlighter and said, I want you to start from the yard and I want you to basically highlight for me what your route would be in a day. And after he did that, I gave him another highlighter and he did it, which I did in all different colors. So until we got through the whole city, and I said, okay, if this is a day, we're going to pick 3 days. We're going to say that is a route, which is going to be a week. But we're only going to book 3 days into it. That way it gave me time for if the operator was out on vacation or sick, if the equipment was down, if it was raining, if we just had some other project we had to work on, I wasn't going to max them out in terms of what they could do where they didn't have breathing room. So lots of times I'd say, hey, you're in route 3, we're in route 1 right now. They'll be there in 2 weeks. And that actually would get there in about a week and a half. So then I was the hero because we got there early versus overcommitting and not being able to do it. So that was another way that we took, again, paper map, and we drew that out, but then we gave that to the RC. They were able to digitize all that and then created these maps for us. And I'm very happy to say that when I ended up hiring the stormwater manager to come in and replace me when I went to assistant director of engineering, Angela Bray, she's fantastic. She's still down in Valdosta. She actually is the one who submitted the 2016 NATO Innovation Award for a street sweeping program, and they won. So it was just really great to see how we went from yellow notebooks to this in a fairly short amount of time. And then, of course, having all this information really helped us to work on our data documentation. So by us having all features digitized, them all having unique symbology and ID numbers, this really helped for us to track everything that we were doing. So I could then pull reports and show how many catch basins have been inspected, which ones have not been looked at. I can check it by date, year, whatever you want me to do, I can pull that data out. But again, we wanted to make sure that we were doing our job and being accountable with it, which also helped reduce our risk. So when we go from that, here we are still doing a lot of paperwork, which was better because we didn't really have a ton of great paperwork before. What we found is the more actively involved that we had our staff, they were continuously moving towards advancement. They really took ownership, and they are the reasons we were able to go from that paper map book into actually movement into a digital realm in terms of computers and stuff like that. We transitioned into that really at their desire, because the more paperwork we had meant the more documentation, which is great, but that paperwork we were then converting into Excel, so then it could be done into GIS, and I was the one taking all that data. And I felt like a glorified intern trying to document all this information so that we could get it into GIS, which was really important. But they needed me doing other things and not just doing that. But my guys couldn't do it because they didn't have computers. So that's when we purchased a couple of computers and some free versions of ArcView, and we worked with our regional commission on this too, so the guys then could see the data just like I could. They just couldn't edit it. And of course, this resulted in us creating more forms, more data, and of course, that was also becoming less time in the field. So this is when we transferred to laptops and tablets. So again, we really wanted to empower our staff to have the information that they needed. So they lost those big, bulky map books, they moved to tablets, and they were able to see everything that I was right there. And then, of course, that also allowed them to start doing all their documentation through the apps that we had on there. So now from the way that we work is the system is completely, all the team members are working from tablets, and they actually do all their work orders and inspections and tracking through their tablets via web app that they have that, again, they work through with the regional commission. And so this really, for me, is just such a glorious story of seeing where we came. And if Valdosta was in that position back in 2007, because I was with them for 11 years, that transitioned in that period of time. So we definitely really moved forward in a lot of things that we were doing. So when you go from getting all your data mapped out, which is so important, this is where you can kind of start customizing some of your stormwater procedures. And this is where we wanted to really look at how do we do this and why do we do it? So the important thing for us is a lot of things that we did was really dictated by that NPDES permit that we had. But we thought, instead of overcomplicating this, let's strip it down. Let's make it as easy as a process as we can, but get that information that EPD needs, but help and make sure that it's something that we can continuously manage. So this is why we did it, which was to formalize our process, because I think we all know people are coming and going, and lately at much more rapid speed than from before, but we want to make sure that we had a consistent routine, that people knew what to do, that that target wasn't constantly moving with them. We wanted to be providing regular operation and maintenance because we wanted to be proactive versus reactive, because that's really where we were at. And then we needed that documentation, not just for claims, but also too, so we could track everything, that we knew that we were getting eyes on everything. But at the end of the day, I can't tell you, I mean, probably every month we were getting some kind of claim request or something didn't turn in, and then we were having to provide documentation. But we had that history. We had all that history of where we had done inspections and repairs, and lots of times when people say we never did anything, we were able to prove that we had, and actually much more than they had even thought. So we're going to talk a little bit about that step-by-step guide. So looking at inspections, maintenance, and disposal. I know you can't see this on here, so we can certainly send this back out, but what we did is we created a simple 2-page form that really provided the layout of how somebody was supposed to inspect our MS4. So it goes over inspections, maintenance, and waste disposal. So if you're like us, lots of times we were digging stuff up and just putting it on the yard and we'd use it later. Well, they actually can consider that to be polluted because of the oils and hydrocarbons and stuff that are getting into the soil. So we had to be very clear in terms of how we were doing inspections, and that's what I liked about this simple section is every year they knew they had to do a minimum amount. So for example, with our catch basins, we had over 6,000. They knew every year we had to do 20% of those. And so every month they got a goal. So we would just divide out that number of that 20%, divide it by 12. And we all know that there's certain times where it's a little bit more challenging to get out there to do inspections, especially when that grass is growing really, really high, and you're constantly having to cut. So in the winter months and early fall, we were actually doing a lot of inspections there, so heavy in the front and heavy in the end. But that allowed us to know what our number was, and we didn't get behind. And I'm happy to say that instead of doing that every 5 years, we were actually got to where we were doing it about every 3. So that just meant we were able to inspect our entire system, do any kind of maintenance that was needed. But it gave us that framework of what the expectations were and how to do it. With each of these, we actually did create forms so that we could document whether it's the catch basins inspections, the ditches, the ponds, the outfalls. And I think I've got in this slide somewhere where we actually did it, where most of the information that we did, it was easy, like you literally could circle it, because we didn't want our guys getting bogged down having to complete a 10-page form for stuff that was really simple. And then of course in there, we kind of guide them in terms of how they're supposed to maintain. So if you go out and you're inspecting a catch basin and you see a bunch of debris at the mouth of the catch basin, you know, we would tell them, don't do a work order for that, clean it right then. And that was captured on that form. Now, if we'd pop manholes and we'd find where somebody had cleaned out a concrete truck and filled up the entire catch basin, that's not something they were able to do right then, so they would issue that work order. And of course, we tracked all that information. And then that way we could make sure that how many open work orders we had and which ones had already been closed out. And then, of course, a debris removal piece. So I already told you that a lot of that stuff we had to make sure went to the landfill. So that was a requirement from EPD. And so they knew that. They didn't just load it up in the truck and take it somewhere. So again, we had to make sure that we were spelling it out for everybody and then making sure that we were breaking any kind of patterns that we had been using before that may have not been in line with what the expectations were. So, oh, there's actually that form I was mentioning. So when you look at that form on the left, so it, again, very small, but this is where they would circle. So we had to know who the inspector was, what the date was, the location. So again, they could use those reference numbers, but if something happened where the system was down, then they could always do an address. But again, they just circled the things that they had done or what needed to be done. And now there's a picture of basically they work from tablets. So everything that was paper is now digital. So they no longer use these forms, but still have them just in case. And as part of this process, I listed out some of the forms and procedures and manuals that we created. As you're building this program, you do end up having to have a lot of documentation. And again, a lot of it comes back where some, didn't know anything about stormwater, what we were putting them out there. And then we had people who worked for 20 years in stormwater and didn't need a manual or a procedure how to do something because they knew it. But we want to make sure that if and when anybody came into our department, they would be able to do that. So really just trying to simplify. And these are just a couple of examples. So when you look at doing those inspections, this is where we got eyes on our system and we found stuff that was just not working. So this is where we did the inspections, we created those work orders, we made repairs, and this is where it's helping to reduce some of our risk. So the top left, you can see where that is an old corrugated metal pipe, also known as CMP. It was completely rusted out at the bottom. Where you can't see it from the picture is there was a lot of erosion happening, so it was starting to drop underneath the road. We came back in and we, as you can see, we replaced it. We put a head wall up on it. It did not have one before. And so again, one of those things like that was a major thoroughfare. And so which this also triggered me to go look at GIS and see how many more corrugated metal pipes we had that went under roads, which there was a significant number. And that became a priority for me to start replacing because the more I can remove the risk ahead of time, the less risk I've got going forward. Another example, that top right, so that is actually a trash trap that one of our other departments created. This was on the upstream side of a culvert, and you can see those are bollards and chain link. And I think in theory, it was a great idea because it was going to catch the stuff before it went into this other area. The problem with that is when that was done, all the yuck and debris and stuff would just mat into the chain link, and then my guys had to go out and hand remove it. So after dealing with that and fussing about it quite a bit, and then of course it broke multiple times, I just kept putting bigger bollards in, but it still kept breaking. We ended up coming in, again, it's a really small picture, but we did a trash trap. And so it's a large contraption that's got, I forget what you call it right now, but anyway, so it has to fill up. We actually have it where we constructed a place for our VACON to pull in. So all they had to do was pull in and they move the arm over and then can suck out all the debris. No one has to get into it. So again, really simplifying it. It was a pretty expensive project. I want to say that was like 150, 200,000, but it takes a major area that we had significant trash and issues with and really alleviated so much manpower. And actually performed much better than what we were doing. So again, something that was really important for us because water would also back up and flood the road. And then the last picture on the bottom, so this is actually near one of our schools. It's a little difficult to see, but if you're at the edge of pavement, we had probably about 2 feet of clearance off of it, and then it dropped off. As you can see, there's sandbags in there. It was really popular to use sandbags years ago. But I think we all know there's not a strong seal in the sandbag, so there's constantly holes creating. So it just made a huge void out from that. At this particular school, all the parents line up like an hour and a half, 2 hours before the kids get out. So they were pulling off on that embankment there, and it really was a tremendous liability. So we didn't want to shut down the road, so we came back in and we slip lined those pipes in there, and of course removed all of the sandbags and did a concrete head wall, which allowed us to add back another probably 4 to 5 feet to give it some more clearance over there. But again, I think looking at all this, what I learned in it is the more inspections that we were doing, the more repairs that we were making, this was really taking us being proactive versus that reactive. Because before we were just kind of out doing our thing, but I will tell you, in cases where we didn't know and didn't have those mapping, our staff didn't always know where city limits was. We were actually working on property that was outside city limits, and sometimes private, because they didn't know. Every time something got annexed in or rezoned or whatever it may be, then people didn't tell Stormwater. It went through planning and zoning, it didn't make it to us. So by having the system mapped out and doing these regular inspections and maintenance, this allowed us to really move from that reactive standpoint of where we were to a much more proactive. And I think when you're looking at it, I really cannot stress enough about knowing your internal resources. My background was environmental planning before I moved into O&M side, and I learned so much being out there in the field and seeing what my guys were doing and learning their skill sets. And I found I had a guy who did great masonry work, and we were contracted somebody else to do our head walls, and they weren't even doing a great job. But when we found what people's gifts were, it was really a blessing for us. And of course, knowing your equipment and your technology, we couldn't have done some of the things that we do now without the technology that we have and without the equipment access. And I think at the end of the day, you've really got to look at what your level of service is. Like, don't overcommit of what you're going to do, but you've got to have a level of service identified, because if you don't, you're just going to be reactive and going in basically kind of a circle. Because then leadership doesn't understand what you're supposed to be doing. The community doesn't understand what you're supposed to be doing. And a perfect example of this is the two pictures you're looking at. The one on the left is actually a Category 1 dam that was constructed by a private property owner illegally. The city was told that it was going to be about $150,000 to fix it, bringing it up into compliance. The city was like, okay, we'll acquire the property because it was near our water plant. We got served with a letter from the Safe Dams program and basically said it either has to be completely redone or breached because it was failing. It's kind of difficult to see, but on the left-hand side of that first picture on your left, there's a tree that has actually got concrete completely around it. There's multiple trees in it. It's an earthen berm, which you can see that all the trees are growing over it. So there's a lot of issues with it. We got our consultant to come in and look at it. They said it would be $10 million to basically remove everything and build it back. So what was going to be a little fishing pond, we were like, we can't spend 10 million. But we also couldn't have a liability of a dam that could breach and take out a major thoroughfare and possibility of loss of life. So we got with another consultant and our contractor. It was going to be about $600,000 to come in and breach it and do sheet pilings. We didn't have $600,000, so I got with my drainage supervisor, and I knew they had done amazing work before, but I was like, let's just sit down and see, could we do this, and how do we do it safely? And we met with the Safe Dam specialist, and we went over what kind of they thought and what our plans were. And my drainage supervisor was like, if I can get this, this, and this in terms of equipment, because we need a long reach arm excavator and a couple other things, then he's like, we can do it. And we did it, and we actually breached it. So that's on the right, what we breached. We did it for a total of $150,000. That included $75,000 to the Safe Dam specialist, so he could write a report for us. And then the other $75,000 was actually for our manpower, and then of course equipment rental. And then a lot of it was overtime because we had to pump everything down, so we had to have somebody watching the pump at all times. But I'm proud to say that the engineers who oversaw our work were actually able to get a national award for this. And looking back at it, so we were told we needed about $80,000 worth of riprap. We didn't have that, but my drainage supervisor was somebody who has always saved concrete, and they said we could use concrete that we had after they looked at it and inspected it and said we could use it. So that saved us $80,000 right there. But again, y'all, we're all faced with so many challenges. I could go after story after story after story of liability and issues. But again, when you know your staff, when you've got a program that's really outlined and you know, and you can prove it and back it up, it's really going to help just your overall response to that and knowing what you're doing in terms of your level of service. So wanted to show you guys just a couple of links. I could probably do pages of these to get you to check out, but these are just a few that I thought if you're looking for information, checking out different ideas, these are some kind of state and federal resources. At the end of the day, you know, save my contact information. I love stormwater. I like almost couldn't sleep last night knowing that we're going to be talking about this because it really is so important. But at the end of the day, I love serving others. And if we can do anything to help you, then that's what we're here for. We don't want you to be suffering and having to figure it all out by yourself. I literally am happy to travel, go wherever, be on phone calls, go out in the field, do inspections, share our forms, whatever we can to help you in any kind of thing that you need help with your stormwater program. And so with that, I just wanted to give you some final thoughts and just reminders of that stormwater does impact every single community. Do that R&D, that rip off and duplicate versus recreating the wheel. Start somewhere and just start small. I mean, it's fine, just start somewhere. Know your resources, be proactive versus reactive, and then document, document, document. At the end of the day, that's going to save you. And of course, that's my contact information at the end. So please feel free to email me, call me, text me anytime, and I'm happy to help. So with that, I will turn it back over to Dan.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. Great job. I hear standing ovation coming on. So does anybody have any questions or comments? Anything they would like to share? Well, with that said, this was great. We got a comment. Great presentation. Any CEUs for this webinar? No, Matthew, there are no CEUs for this webinar. We don't provide those for webinars. But thanks for asking. Sorry, Matthew. There was a sad face that Matthew put up. Agreed, great presentation. Other than looking at CMP in street crossings, that other filters did you use on, I think it's filters, GIS for maintenance? Other than looking at CMP in street crossings, what other filters did you use on GIS for maintenance? Do you know what that?
I don't really understand
the question. Here's another question. What software do you use?
So they use ArcGIS now. And they use like the stormwater manager now. She actually has the, the full blown license and everything on her computer. And then the team is using an app through ArcGIS.
This was very helpful as we are working more on addressing aging infrastructure. That is for sure. Thank you so much for doing that. Major opportunities for improvement there within most of our membership, I would assume. Any other questions or comments? So as I said at the beginning, I will be sending out a link to the recording so you can use. I'll also be sending out my presentation along with Emily's presentation for reference. If there's anything you'd like to share with the group, again, I'll probably be doing that. I'd have to do some editing, but it'll probably be early next week. Well, maybe later next week by the time I get it to you, because I have a couple of two-day meetings at the beginning of the week. But if there's something you'd like to share, you think a best practice that you think you've done, would love to see that. So send that to my email address at dbeck@lgrms.com. Again, happy to see and share anything that you present out. I'm sure we have many years of experience out there. Anything, words of wisdom before we say goodbye, Emily?
Just say when people email you, if they can email you, if people are using some kind of platform for their, inspections, maintenance, whatever it may be, even just visualizing the system, let us know, because we have a lot of communities trying to figure this out right now. And understand not everybody can use Esri products. So again, let us know what you're doing, because we want to make sure we can share that with other cities. Because at the end of the day, we don't want to struggle. We want to make sure we can get people what they need.
And again, to your point, if you have the problem, more than likely somebody else has the same exact problem. And if you have a solution for that problem, more than likely somebody else can use that solution. No matter how small that solution is. It might be a major win for somebody that's in the process of trying to figure some of these things out. So please don't be too proud to share those information. Any best practice you can provide, we'd love to be able to provide to all the membership. With that said, thank you so very much, Emily, for your presentation. A+ as always. And to all those that attended, we did have a lot of good attendance today. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you so much for the work you do on a day-to-day basis. You are so very blessed to be in charge of storm water management. You have one question here. So information will be provided by a link. Yes, the PowerPoint presentations will be sent out, but a link of the recording will be sent out probably sometime next week. Okay. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. We will talk later.
Thanks, y'all.